my pleasure to introduce our speaker. And Andrea Proctor is an anthropologist with 20 years experience working with Indigenous communities in Labrador. In 2017, she joined the Newfoundland and Labrador Healing and Commemorative Project with James Iglesiorte to document the stories of Labrador's boarding schools. Her book, A Long Journey, Residential Schools in Labrador and Newfoundland, which I happen to have here, has been recognized as a model of collaborative research with Indigenous communities and has won numerous awards, including the Atlantic Canada Book Award for Scholarly Writing, the Canadian Historical Society Clio Prize, and the Newfoundland and Labrador Book Prize for Nonfiction. She has a PhD from Memorial University. I now pass the evening over to Andrea Proctor and a presentation, Against All Odds. Oh no, that's the right, that was Bill Gillespie's Reconciliation and Residential Schools in Labrador. Andrea, take it away.
Yes, thank you, John. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. So I've been thinking about reconciliation, this huge, difficult, beautiful idea that I think gets tossed around quite a bit. And a central part of reconciliation is learning about our history of colonialism, learning about residential schools, and then using that knowledge to rethink our own perspectives today. Over the past decade or so, former boarding school students in Labrador have described their experiences and how it's affected them. So we now know the damage, we know the trauma that the boarding schools caused for Indigenous children and their families. So how can we use this knowledge in our own lives today and not treat it as something that simply happened in the past? How can we rethink our own perspectives? I come to this as a non-Indigenous person. I'm an anthropologist. I grew up in Toronto and eventually came to St. John's. And in 2017, as John said, I worked, or James Iglesiorte invited me to join the Newfoundland and Labrador Residential School Healing and Commemoration Project to document the history of the boarding schools in Labrador. So we traveled through Labrador and talked with many former students about their experiences, and out of that work came the book, A Long Journey. So my talk tonight comes from that work. There were 6 boarding schools in Labrador at Nain, Makkovik, Northwest River, Muddy Bay, Cartwright, and Mary's Harbor, and an orphanage at St. Anthony. They were run and established by the Moravian Mission and the International Grenfell Association. And about 2,000 Indigenous children lived in them between 1906 and 1980. So they were started before Labrador became part of Canada in 1949. And so the Federal Indian Act did not apply, and so they weren't part of the Indian residential school system. In the Healing and Commemoration Project, we listened to former students talk about their memories, and we heard about the harmful impacts that the boarding schools had. So I'd like to recognize and acknowledge the pain and the harm that the students and their families experienced. We heard about the shame that children learn to feel about their Indigenous families and background. We heard about abuse of all kinds, about trauma. We heard about children losing touch with their families and losing the chance to learn cultural skills, language, and parenting at home. And we heard how this harm has impacted the children's, or the students' children and grandchildren and later generations, so that the pain and trauma of the boarding schools is felt through the generations. Now, not everyone had these experiences, and I'd like to acknowledge those who had good experiences. But in order to come to terms with the legacy of the boarding schools, we need to look at how they caused harm. And in listening to these stories, it's easy to condemn the people who ran the boarding schools. It's easy to see them as bad people and to think that we're more enlightened now that we would never do such horrible things. And I think it makes us feel good to condemn other people, and especially people in the past, I think, and I'm speaking here again as a non-Indigenous person, I think it makes us feel as if we are good people who are on the right side of history. But I think that's a lazy position to take, because it doesn't encourage us to really examine our own perspectives. It doesn't encourage us to learn anything. Instead, I think that we as Canadians, and particularly those of us who are non-Indigenous, need to be introspective. We need to be honest enough to bring ourselves into the picture. We need to examine the intentions and the assumptions of the organizations that ran the boarding schools in order to ensure that we are not adopting the same assumptions and practices today. Because in most cases, the people who ran the boarding schools really did think that they were doing the best thing for the children. They thought of themselves as good people as well. So how is it that they caused such harm? One thing that really struck me as I learned more about this history, as I looked into the history, was that these boarding schools were always sites of negotiation and conflict, often between the authorities that ran them and the local people. And education was never really the issue. Families wanted their children to be educated, and they often fought for schools, but they also wanted to weigh in on the education that their children received. They challenged the schools when the education was subpar or disrespectful, or when their children were being mistreated. Throughout Labrador, one main incentive for boarding schools was the need to gather children together. In many places in Labrador, it's really only been since the 1960s that people lived permanently in communities. Before then, in many places, families lived in dispersed homesteads, and they traveled seasonally, often between different homes, to hunt and fish and trap. And so there were very rarely were there enough children to have a school. And in Northern Labrador, the Moravian missionaries had solved this problem to some extent with cooperation from Inuit families. Inuit lived on the land during the year, but the Christian families came into the Moravian stations for Christmas, and they often stayed until Easter. So Moravian missionaries taught day school to Inuit children for these few weeks of the year, and they provided a religious education and taught basic literacy in Inuktitut. So these day schools had been running since the 1770s, and the missionaries really valued these schools because they saw education as a way to mold the young generation of Inuit into abiding and faithful and conforming Christians. And some Inuit also became teachers, like this couple in Maine, Nathaniel and Friederike Eliniatitzio. They taught at the day school, although in 1920, these two also offered to take in any children whose parents were willing to let them stay behind while they went off hunting. So the idea of a boarding school itself was not a foreign thing as well. And Inuit were involved in teaching and in running the schools. And then in 1926, the Hudson's Bay Company bought the trading rights from the Moravian Mission. And the Hudson's Bay Company encouraged people to trap for fox furs in the winter. So families were no longer coming into the mission stations, and the children were no longer attending school. So the missionaries at Nain decided to open a boarding school. And right from the start, you can see that Inuit have a significant degree of authority and involvement in the school. As a missionary wrote in 1931, "We were trying a new experiment in the school. I was astonished to find that almost all parents were willing enough to leave their children there." However, in the first year, there was only one teacher for 45 students. And when she got frustrated with the children, she disciplined them harshly. And the parents complained to the Moravian missionary, who was also the father of the teacher. So the teacher, Kate Hetash, wrote, "The next day, the parents came to Nain to complain to Dad about the cruel, very cruel teacher. And if it was not stopped at once, several parents would take their children out of school." So the missionaries were always very aware that Inuit were watching and were monitoring what went on in the school. But they also started to see the boarding school as a way of having even more control and influence over children than a day school. And they really wanted to remove children from the influence of their home life. And they wanted children to live at the school so they could watch over them and train them. And Kate Hetash wrote in 1931, "We are anxious to have a proper boarding school, to have the children with us, away from the bad influence at home. Only then can we have some hope for a following better generation." And her father, Paul Hetash, used the same argument. He wrote, "Our hopes for the Inuit are centered in our school. Unfortunately, the influence we have upon the children is often heavily counteracted by appalling home conditions. It is very difficult for folk in Europe to realize how small, dark, dirty, and overcrowded many of the Inuit homes are. And consisting, as most of them do, of one room only, it is not surprising that many Inuit have not high moral standards. In our clean and large school buildings, the children are well housed and fed, and their spiritual needs are constantly before the teachers." So in using this kind of language, the missionaries promoted the idea that Inuit were immoral, dirty, and poor parents, and that they therefore needed to save the children somehow by removing them from their homes and transforming them into something different, into something better. And the boarding schools allowed the missionaries to keep a close eye on the children. They wrote, "We see the urgent need of a place where children may be watched more carefully than in their own homes." And even the Inuit staff in the dormitory were closely controlled by the missionaries. Evelyn Winters describes how her grandmother, Bella Leo, was a house parent in Maine. And one day Bella's parents came to visit her. And she said, "Kate Hetash was already gone home. When she would go home, they were locked in the dorm. The door was locked from the outside, so Bella's parents couldn't visit. They just spoke by the window because they were locked in." But while the missionaries tried their best to control Inuit children and staff, they really couldn't have complete authority over them. Inuit leaders and families maintained quite extensive influence over what went on. And for instance, in the 1940s, many parents in the Hopedale region were angry with how their children were being treated at the Makkovik boarding school. And they claimed that the staff were racist towards their children, that they were given too much labor to do, and that they wanted a school in Hopedale so that they wouldn't have to send their children away. And in 1949, they withdrew their children from the Makkovik boarding school in protest and forced the missionaries to open a day school in Hopedale. And eventually this protest led to the closure of the Makkovik boarding school in 1955. Inuit in Nain also fought against missionary control. Tabia Murphy was a child in the boarding school in the 1940s in Nain, and she describes the time when she was allowed home on the first Sunday of Advent for a few hours, but she was expected to go back to the dormitory before supper. And she describes how when the school staff came to get her, she said, "My grandfather said, let her stay. She can go back to school tomorrow morning." So they left without me. Nothing Kate Hatash could do, for my grandfather was an elder on the church committee. I was 5 years old. In those days, especially Reverend Paul Hatash and his daughter, Kate Hatash, were like royalty. I remember when we would go to church, we children had to stay in the porch until the missionaries came into church. We children were together to say good evening, like they were royalty. In the 1930s, the documents in the Moravian archives show how frustrated the missionaries were with the Inuit involvement in the main school. One missionary wrote, "The schoolhouse is right in the village, and the parents of the children interfere and complain far too much if things do not go as they think they should. This causes unpleasantness, which is disturbing and trying for the teachers." So as a solution, and you can see in this picture, the missionaries decided to move the schoolhouse down from the area where people live, marginally down towards where Illusiwak now is now. Oh, sorry. So the missionaries argued that the children needed to be separated from the influence of their families and taught what they claimed were superior ways of living and behaving. And by criticizing Inuit parents, they undermined the authority of Inuit families and made the children feel as if there was something wrong with their families, with their parents. The missionaries tried to assert this total control over the children in their care through surveillance and through this strict authority. But it was always a struggle. It was always an incomplete attempt to dominate and to change Inuit society. Inuit families challenged the missionaries, assumed moral superiority, and they challenged their racism and their attempts to control them. And the Inuit used their own means of governance to challenge the missionaries when they needed to, and they asserted their own interests. And again, it was never that education was education was never the issue. Inuit families simply wanted to ensure that they had some control over their children's education. So in central and southern Labrador, the Anglican Church and the International Grenfell Association provided medical and social services in the early 1900s. And in the early days, Wilfred Grenfell and his staff tried to help children from poor families by sending them away to live with other families in the United States, in Canada, and in Britain. As Grenfell wrote, "In my boyhood, I used to collect postage stamps, butterflies, and birds' eggs. When we sailed to Labrador, however, I started to collect children." And in one of his books, Grenfell describes how he decided to rescue 2 young boys from their family in Hamilton Inlet. He said, "Soon the father came home. I can see him still, the vacant brown eyes of a very feeble-minded half-breed, ragged and tattered and almost bootless." And so Grenfell tells this very heroic story of grabbing the boys away from their family in 1908. And they're not named in his story, in his book, but they were James and William Shuglow, and they were sent to the St. Anthony Orphanage, where they stayed for 6 and 9 years. And Grenfell's story and the way he tells it shows that he is absolutely certain that he's doing the right thing. He portrays himself as benevolent, as wise, and as superior to the father, who he portrays as feeble-minded, as unable to support his family, and as racially inferior. So Grenfell's moral certainty and his cultural superiority allowed him to think that he had the right to arbitrarily remove children from their families. Now, this belief that children were better off outside of Labrador was not widely shared by the people who established the Labrador Public School at Muddy Bay in 1920. Anglican minister Henry Gordon wrote in 1921, "It is not our desire that any of the children should have to leave their country, but rather that they should return to their own homes and infuse their own people with the new ideals and hopes which the school has given them." And this boarding school at Muddy Bay initially did have strong local support as families wanted their children to get an education. But like the missionaries, the Moravian missionaries, the staff at the Muddy Bay School judged its success by how much children had changed by their time there. As Gordon wrote, "Though scarcely beyond the first 3 months of our existence, there are the most evident signs of the good that is being done. We've been privileged to see cases of complete transformation. It is an honest fact that some of the children have altered so much that their relatives do not know them." So again, the school staff is stressing the importance of removing the children from the influence of their families in order to transform them into something better. A visitor in 1923 wrote that the children are, quote unquote, taken away from unwholesome surrounding wicked environments and transplanted into a well-regulated and ordered institution where they are given the advantage of a better living and giving incentives to aspire to something better than their fathers had been used to. So again, although the initial goal of the boarding school was to give local children an academic education, the staff soon emphasized its role in transforming children socially. And this social reform work was based on the notion that Inuit families were negligent, dirty, and poor, and their children could only be saved if they were removed from their homes and taught to want better and to act better than their parents. And better, of course, means the values and behaviors of dominant white society. Some IGA staff also adopted Grenfell's approach towards adopting Inuit children out of Labrador. One doctor and his wife, who acted as the house mother at the Lockwood dormitory near Cartwright, tried to convince several families to allow them to adopt their daughters and bring them to the United States with them. This was in the 1940s. As Andrea Weber said, "The very first place I went to school was Cartwright, and when I was 9 years old. Dr. and Mrs. Forsyth wanted to take me to the States to live with them. Can you imagine? They sent a telegram to tell my parents they wanted to take me, the only daughter in the family." And they seem to have made this request of a number of families, and but the Labrador families were very clear in their refusal for these requests for their children. Many of the boarding schools were focused on teaching the children habits and values concerning cleanliness and discipline. Betty Fife, who was a teacher at Lockwood in the 1930s, described the value of this social training. And she wrote, "What is the use of this education? Why bring them up in a house with bathrooms and running water when they're going back to some tiny wooden shack to spend the rest of their lives in fishing and trapping? Surely habits of cleanliness and methodical work acquired when they were young will persist even under less favorable conditions and help them to make their own homes better and still better with each generation." At the St. Anthony Orphanage, the IGA staff also focused on teaching children to maintain these standards of cleanliness. And they kept records about the children's lives after they had left the orphanage and noted any improvements in moral principles or in the standard of living. For instance, they commented that one former student is living in the same miserable condition as when he first came to the orphanage. Evidently, the only good accomplished here was that he acquired a love of reading. He is as dirty as ever. So staff made these judgments about morality and cleanliness openly, and they passed on to the children the idea that Inuit were dirty and that their families were something to be embarrassed of. Rose Oliver from Rigolet went to the dorm in Northwest River in the 1960s, and she described how these sorts of judgments affected her. She said, "My life was forever changed as I knew it. I left home a growing teenager, learning my traditional ways and living with a big happy family. When I returned home after a few years of dorm life, being ashamed of myself, the Inuit girl, and being ashamed of my dear mom and her ways, such as sealskin on the walls drying, and a smelly house from having no bathrooms, and the smell of fish cooking and seal cooking. I was confused. I loved my family, but somehow it got ingrained in me that they were savages, dirty, and lazy. When I returned, I was a new race. I felt like an alien in my beloved home. I was a stranger now. Our values were different. I had an education, and Mom didn't ever go to school. I never did tell my family what happened to me in those 4 years at the dorm. I was too ashamed of myself for changing into someone I did not like or know." So by teaching the children that the dominant white society's social values were superior to Indigenous values and practices, the boarding schools demeaned Indigenous society, and they undermined the authority of Indigenous elders, and especially Indigenous women. As Rose said, she became ashamed of her dear mom and her ways. The boarding schools also taught students about social manners and behaviors. And of course, social manners are never neutral. These were British and American middle-class manners. And in teaching them, the staff were also teaching about social distinctions. The main lesson that many children learned from this was that they were inferior. As Millicent Loader described it, the staff was good to us, but they always let us know that we were not their equals. The staff came from abroad and felt themselves to be missionaries, trying to bring a bit of England to the Labrador wild. In the same building, they ate apart from us, had different food, and better living quarters. Other students describe acting as maids for the IGA staff in the Lockwood dormitory. Avis Lethbridge Kramer said, "I wore a black uniform with a white apron, and I used to set their dining room table and serve the meal to the staff. Their dining room was very formal. They would ring the little silver bell when they were ready for dinner to be served. I was always so afraid I wouldn't hear the bell. Everything was so formal, and I thought it was such an honor to be a maid. I always thought they were so much better than I was. Boy, have I changed my way of thinking." So many of the Moravian missionaries and the IGA staff made it clear that they were socially distinct from the people that they had come to help. And they often formed an elite group that was separate from the community. Some boarding schools justified their existence by arguing that they were providing an opportunity for children from small communities to get an academic education that they wouldn't otherwise get. The IGA staff at Northwest River in particular fought for federal funding to build a large senior dormitory for Indigenous high school students from the coast in the 1970s. And they used two main arguments about why they needed to bring Inuit children to Northwest River for school. And the two arguments were, one, the school could provide a solid academic education based on Western culture. And two, that the community would immerse the children in a quote unquote dominantly white environment where they could learn to assimilate into white society. But Inuit students and leaders were quick to critique these arguments. Many did want their children to have an academic education, but they wanted it to reflect Inuit culture and language. As Sam Metcalf of Nain said, the current system teaches only the values of white society. The Inuit could do the best job of teaching their children the values of their own unique society. Rose Pomachador from Nain was hired in 1974 as an Indigenous educational consultant. And she was also very blunt in condemning the argument that Inuit needed to be removed from their families in order to get a good education. And she wrote, "There are many arguments for continuing the present boarding school system. Let's look at them. One, we need exposure to another culture. In the 11 years that we spend in school, we already receive a great deal of exposure to your other culture. In fact, the totality of our school experience is based on your culture. What more do we need exposure to? Your prejudice and discrimination. Experiences in Northwest River are not always pleasant, and I do not think they can be justified as being a preparation for life. There has been a great deal of money invested in the new high school and dormitory at Northwest River. If the government had consulted the people instead of the IGA, this mistake could have been avoided." And I should say too that her comment that experiences in Northwest River are not always pleasant was in many cases an understatement. Many former students that we talked to detailed how they were subject to racist abuse and sexual abuse at while they lived in the dorm in Northwest River. So Rose Pomach and other Inuit leaders eventually succeeded in the late 1970s in convincing the government to give the coastal schools enough resources to offer high school classes so children didn't have to leave home. And again, it wasn't that Inuit didn't want education. They very much did, but they wanted it at home, and they wanted to have more control over the curriculum and the way that their children were taught. So the boarding schools in Labrador were designed to teach Indigenous children academic subjects, but they were also designed to give them a social training in the behaviors and values of the dominant white society, all under the broader lesson that Indigenous families and Indigenous cultures were inferior. And it was this social training, this racism, and this attempt to assimilate their children and to demean their culture that Indigenous communities challenged. We often talk about the violence of residential schools. And this usually means physical violence or sexual violence. But this assault on Indigenous families, on Indigenous mothers, on Indigenous culture is another form of violence that is equally harmful and has lifelong impacts on individuals and on communities. The boarding school staff justified these attempts to train and assimilate Indigenous children by believing that they were morally and culturally superior, that Indigenous society was somehow deficient and inferior, and that their wealth and class, their race and their education gave them the right to make judgments about Indigenous peoples and to make decisions about what was best for them. And it was often done in the name of humanitarianism and benevolence, which is a very tricky thing because it's very hard, of course, to criticize. The IGA and the Moravians were always very quick to point out how much money they had spent, how much they had worked in the service of others, and what good people they were. And this becomes very difficult to argue against because you don't want to seem ungrateful or resentful. And many former students talked about, told us about how at one point it was almost impossible for them to say anything bad about the boarding schools. It was taboo, as Toby Obed told us. They felt that they were only allowed to express gratitude and obligation for what the Moravian missionaries and the IGA had done. But there's also, of course, an element of power there, because of course, if someone says, I spent all this money on you, then you don't feel like you have the right to criticize. This structure of obligation takes away your ability to fully and to openly express yourself and to make your own decisions. As Millicent Loader said about her time in the boarding schools, the hardest thing to bear was that there was no one to put their arms around you when you were feeling bad. No one understood how you could miss your family and your home so much, but they would tell you how lucky you were that you were in a place where you could have better food and nicer clothes. So for me, in learning about this history, I find myself jumping very quickly to the moral high ground in condemning those involved in the boarding schools for their violence towards Inuit in Labrador. But I'm realizing that when I do this, I'm positioning myself as an innocent witness, as a good witness to the history of residential schools and colonialism. And I'm creating a blind spot for myself because I'm making it impossible to imagine that I could somehow also be inflicting violence on Indigenous peoples myself. So I'm acting in the same way that the boarding school staff acted. They shielded themselves from having to question their own assumptions because they were so certain that they were right. They felt that they were on the moral high ground. And so they became blind to how they were causing damage because they saw themselves as good people and therefore incapable of causing harm. And so I want to try to shake off these blind spots by posing some questions. And these questions are directed mainly at non-Indigenous people, but they're probably also questions that we can all consider. So what kind of harm are we causing today by assuming that we know what's best for others, or by making assumptions and assuming authority over other people? Are we allowing ourselves to fully, are we allowing others to fully express themselves and to make their own decisions? Or are we preventing them from speaking up because we hold the power of obligation or some other power over them? Are we focusing on other people's deficiencies, or are we recognizing their strengths and their autonomy? The ultimate goal of reconciliation is to have mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. And these questions all relate to relationships. How do we interact with each other? How do we respect each other? How do we respect each other's autonomy? How do we not cause violence to each other? And these are questions that can relate to relationships between us as individuals, to relationships that we're in at work, to relationships that are impacted by government policies, to relationships between governments, between nations. But we really need to rethink our relationships and our assumptions, because even though the boarding schools have closed, some of these ways of causing violence to Indigenous peoples still exist. And I think this is the uncomfortable work of reconciliation. It would be much easier, it would take much less effort as non-Indigenous people to simply be empathetic witnesses to Indigenous suffering without feeling the need to change ourselves, without feeling that responsibility. But I think that shirks the responsibility, that avoids the responsibility that we all have to work towards reconciliation. Boarding school students fought so hard to have their stories heard and their experiences acknowledged. And we all have a responsibility now to use that knowledge and to learn something from this difficult history of residential schools in Labrador. And before I finish, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to everyone who has been involved in this work. This has always been a collaborative effort. And I'm so grateful and appreciative of all of the former boarding school students and everyone who has been committed to this work. So, Nakumiik.
Well, Andrea, Nakumiik. We often said when we're up in Nain, if you were really, really thankful, it would be Nakumiik. And Chiniskimitten for the Innu. Anyway, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And before we get to the questions, I just want to let the audience know, to remind them, they probably already have notice of this already, that there is a special offer through the publisher of her book. And it's a 30% off the recommended retail price. And the persons attending the lecture will receive a discount code, or they may have had it already. And the magic word is historical. The way I got it was all caps, but I'm not sure if it's capital sensitive or not. Anyway, you use the word historical and you get 30% off by ordering directly from the publisher at the www.memorialuniversitypress.ca. Okay, so we're at the stage where we can entertain both chat line questions and comments, and I'm going to ask Leah to acknowledge the people that either want to do one or the other. Okay. I don't know if we have anybody holding up their hand that want to make a comment.
No questions yet.
Okay. Maybe try a couple of the chat line comments. There are a couple there that are descriptive.
Lots of thanks for Andrea.
Good. I saw a longer comment by Bill English and another one there by Richard Budgell. Maybe you could read those two.
Oh, just a moment. Let me scan back here. Let's see here. Just a moment.
Okay.
There was a significant factor in the establishment of Muddy Bay was as an orphanage for children orphaned as a result of the Spanish influenza in Sandwich Bay.
I think that's a comment from Richard Budgell.
Yeah, yes, definitely. The planning for the Muddy Bay School actually started before the Spanish flu, and they were well into it when the Spanish flu hit, but it really did devastate Sandwich Bay, and 40, I think around 40 children were left without one or both parents from the Spanish flu. So yes, the orphanage, the Muddy Bay School in its early years did double as an orphanage as well.
Okay.
And from William English, it has, the interesting thing is that the teachers, etc., spoke of indigenous people being immoral, dirty, etc., but were slow to speak of them as poor, deprived, and neglected by white society. Resources went into boarding schools, but not into the local people.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. That's brilliant. I love it. Yes, they again, looking at the deficiencies, looking at individuals and communities as having something wrong with them, instead of looking at the larger structural societal problems and causes of this inequality in Labrador. So thank you for that, Bill.
And Hannah Woodward has the question, did settler children ever attend the schools if they lived in the community?
Yes, so settler in the Labrador meaning of the word, in terms of children of mixed ancestry, would attend the schools. In some cases, there were English schools and Inuktitut schools. So in Nain, for instance, there was an English language school for the settler children and an Inuktitut school for the Inuit children. And the Makhovik boarding school was an English language school, and a mix of Inuit and settlers children went there. We don't really tend to use that word settler in that way anymore. Everyone is considered Inuit. If you mean the word, the settler in terms of non-Indigenous children, no, they were not as a set rule, but most children of the missionaries, for instance, or children of the storekeepers were often sent away for school. They, which is interesting because they were obviously not considering the schools to be good enough for their children.
Okay, and I believe was it Patrick Murray who had a question? I saw a raised hand pop up, but it's gone away now. So I believe the recording, to answer this other question, the recording will be on the Newfoundland Historical Society's website?
Yes, yes, that's right.
Okay. And
if I can jump in, Leah, I see a question from Catherine Richards about
How do I get the
whether the residential schools are still standing and if they're repurposed and commemorated on site, and that's a great question. It's different in each community. There's one building left in Nain that, for those of you who know Nain, the old Okhalhatagit Society building was a school building, was a dormitory for a while. It's still there. It's sort of falling apart. I think it's just used as a storage building, I think. I'm not sure what the plans are for it. I don't think there's much interest in and jump in, anyone from Nain here who has a better answer than me. But I don't think there's much interest in the community in celebrating that building. The school in Makhovik burned down in 1948 and wasn't really, it doesn't really exist where the boarding school was, although the White Elephant Museum in Makhovik was the original little tiny dormitory, but it really wasn't a dormitory for the boarding school for very long. In Northwest River, the senior dormitory still exists, and the junior dorm is still standing. In Cartwright, there are no physical buildings left anymore. The Muddy Bay School burned down in 1928, and the Lockwood dormitory was demolished. I'm not sure when exactly, a couple of decades ago, I think, and the schoolhouse building was demolished just a year and a half ago. And in St. Anthony, the orphanage is still there. It's used as apartment buildings, I think, now.
And then there's a question from David Beauchamp. How many children do we estimate have lived in the boarding schools?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's very difficult to know for sure. The records are really very poor. I estimate about 2,000 children, but that's really a wild guess. The records are really, really poor.
Andrea, I had a question, and that's, I noticed that most of the book is about the Inuit experience, but I did notice that you did have a chapter at the end talking about the Innu experience, both in Sheshatshiu and in Davis Inlet and now in Attawashish.
Yeah, so the Innu were not heavily involved in these boarding schools. The boarding schools were built either by the Moravian ones were built for Inuit children, and the IGA ones were not really focused on Innu children. The Innu had their own very difficult experiences with the Roman Catholic priests in Davis Inlet and in Sheshatshiu. So they, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the priests were active in establishing schools for the Innu children, but they were really focused on, and the governments at that time were really focused on forcing really the Innu families to live permanently in the community. So they didn't actually want residential schools, because if you have a residential school, the parents could be off in the country, and that was not the goal at that time. So they had day schools. Mm-hmm. But yes, they were Catholic day schools. There were, of course, some Innu children who ended up in St. Anthony or in Northwest River, often because they were sent there for medical care, and so they stayed in the dormitories. But they're not, the majority of Innu children had priests as teachers.
And then Michael Pretty has a question. He's got his hand raised. So get him unmuted.
Here we go. Yay. So I got, my computer died, then I had to log back on, and of course Microsoft decided to do some updates while I was doing that. So I have this. I've about 150 pages into it, and thank you for writing it. It must not have been easy. So I have a question, and so a bit about me before I ask my question. So I was a soldier for 33 years, and I did a lot of work with Indigenous groups in British Columbia and the Northwest Territories, and as like liaison to them with the military and different things that we would have to do for them. And I made a lot of friends in the Indigenous community all around Canada, and some of them were soldiers of mine. And always, the older ones were always had a trouble. And when I started talking to them, more as a friend as opposed to their officer, they would tell me stories, and I went, man, they must be making this up. Mm-hmm. Right? And then I do a lot of work now with the Red Cross in Baffin Island and up in Sheshatshiu and Northwest River and Rigolette, and with community work, doing building teamwork and search and rescue teams and stuff like that. So it's a lot of fun, but you can tell with the age groups of them what they go through. So 2 questions. One is, what did you notice in your research any differences in how the schools were conducted, or the severity of how they were conducted from when they were organized by either the Newfoundland government or the Moravians, vice when Canada, we became part of Canada in 1949, or Canada became part of Newfoundland, depends how you look at it. Was there any significant changes in policies or protocols or how the schools were run, did you notice?
The main difference, I think, was after 1949, when the provincial government really started to take an interest in education. And so the 1955, the provincial government took over the education from the Moravian mission, for instance. And so after that point, all of the schools were run or overseen by the provincial government. The dormitories, though, the boarding schools, or at least the dormitories that were often attached to community schools, were always separate, though. The government really didn't want to get involved in that. And so even after 1955, even though the Moravians had handed over the control of the education, they still kept control of the
lives
dorm.
after school.
Yeah,
and the dorms.
yeah.
It's like one of the things we learned as peacekeepers is when you go into another place to try to help them, you always say, well, how do you run it? And what are your territorial boundaries, as opposed to just we make our own up? And the other question I have, I don't know if it was part of your research, is that studies in Holocaust survivors in their grandchildren that PTSD or the trauma that their grandparents went through is almost in their DNA, and it's like generational trauma based on what the biological and physical changes that their grandparents went through.
Yeah.
So I know that's a pretty deep question, but it's
yes. And I mean, the impacts are extensive. It's shocking. And if I can push another talk, so Ashley Dicker and Ashley is from Nain. She was here. I'm not sure if she's still here, but she and I are doing, hey, there you are. Another a talk about that subject in particular, actually. And Ashley has multiple generations of people in her family who went to boarding schools, and so she's able to speak to that a bit more. But it is, I mean, the last boarding school closed in 1980, but it's still quite raw. It's still, the impacts are still quite shocking.
I remember just like being with some of the men who were Indigenous, and they were trouble, and you could never figure it out. And I wish I had have known a little bit of what I'm trying to understand now of what they were going through just to survive, just to live. And thank you for your answers. I'll let somebody else speak. I can go on forever. Sorry.
So Kim Penny has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Andrea. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So my question is kind of along the lines of Michael's. I've heard you speak before in my work environment, and I don't think I've truly grasped the whole idea of intergenerational trauma until a contemporary of mine spoke about not knowing how to parent because she wasn't parented. And that's how that trauma is passed down through her family, and she has to learn now as a woman in her 40s how to be a parent and how to show love to her child. So I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on you know, the non-Indigenous like myself. When you think intergenerational trauma, I didn't really quite understand what it meant till I heard her say those words. I have had to learn how to parent because I wasn't parented.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Just wanted to get, I guess, some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and you hear that a lot from a number of people. Shirley Flowers, for instance, talks about being in the car one day with her daughter who had just turned 13, and Shirley, who's from Rigolet and went to the dorm in Northwest River, she said, all of a sudden, I didn't know how to be her mother, because when Shirley was a teenager, she was in this institution, and it's a different, you don't have somebody looking over you. You don't have somebody helping you, guiding you, answering your questions. When you're in an institutional life like that, you don't learn these things. And I think we kind of take that for granted because that's not a common experience. But for people who did have to live in institutions, I think that has had devastating impacts. I would suggest too, and I think somebody said this in the comments too, Josie Penny wrote a book called So Few on Earth, about her experiences at Lockwood. And she talks about, it's a beautiful book. It's a devastating book. It's heartbreaking, but I would really recommend it for people. And she talks about that impact that has had on her life and on her parenting as well too, and on her inability to express emotion and to show love too, as you said.
And then we have a question from David Carter. With the demise of the residential schools, how is education currently handled?
Yeah, so the Nunatsiavut government and the Nunatsiavut Community Council have been working very hard to change the curriculum to have a curriculum that reflects Indigenous culture, has Inuktitut involved in it. So they've been really transforming the education on the coast. And as I said, in the late 1970s, Inuit leaders also pushed for this funding for the high schools. So since the 1980s, all of the coastal communities, especially on the North Coast, have day schools K to 12. So yeah, so it's really, and I think the provincial government is seeing that more and more and realizing that they need to give the Indigenous groups more control over their education.
And then there is a question from Susan.
Yes.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, there. I wasn't sure if it would come through. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. First, I feel, well, thanks very much, Andrea, for your presentation. I've read your book, and it was really an interesting book. I think I have to give a shout out to the Moravians for teaching in Inuktitut, because that was not the case in many schools across the country, where their own language was kind of written over kind of thing, with mostly English wherever you go. So I think that, and I also picked up from your book that really the Moravians and the Grenfell Mission were not trying to educate. They were trying to educate. I mean, they may have been going about it in ways that I don't agree with or whatever, but they were trying to educate. And I think that has to be realized as well. And I'm wondering if you would see, like, I think another part of this picture is that the whole Labrador as a place was kind of abandoned by the Newfoundland government. Like, we had nothing to do with them. We didn't care whether they were educated or not. And it was left really to the Moravians and eventually the Grenfell Mission as well to come in there and do what I guess they felt was kind of the right thing to do. I don't know what we would be saying today if there had been no education at all. We might be saying something harsh about that kind of thing as well. I'm wondering if you would see a difference between, let's say, the early days and the later days prior to Confederation, and then after Confederation, and which part of that became in a way more problematic, or of course you wouldn't have done a lot of interviews with people who were educated 100 years ago. So, but I'm wondering how you see, I sort of think there were probably different phases in what was going on up there. I'm also going to just comment that I've read a lot about the West as well, and I lived out West. And one book that was a horrible realization for me was called Clearing the Plains. I don't know if you've read that. Have you read it? Yeah. And you know, it's just horrendous what the Canadian government did in, I guess, with other people cooperating, but it was very, very deliberate what they were doing, and they were trying to get rid of the Indians and of course get the Indian out of the child. So I guess I don't feel that I know that it was really very bad for the children in many ways, but not on that same level of, well, I don't think you'll find I don't think you'll be finding bodies buried, for example, and that sort of stuff. And I don't want to even compare to that really, because I know that not being taken away, but living away from your families, and you came from families that were for the most part loving families, and you were made to feel that you know, you weren't as good as the people who were teaching you and that sort of thing. So I know that's a bad thing, but you know, I just wanted to give some comments here and ask you for any perspective on that.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think it's not productive to compare what's worse, what's a bad situation, what's a worse situation. Indigenous former students have been fighting for years and years, and especially after Prime Minister Harper gave his apology in 2008 and Labrador was excluded. Indigenous students were very upset that they were excluded, and they have worked very hard to tell the world that their experiences were equivalent to the Canadian experiences. And so I think we need to recognize that and to respect that. In terms of the difference over time, all of these schools were quite different and quite unique in their own ways. And so again, it's difficult to compare the Northwest River boarding school in the 1970s with the Muddy Bay school in the 1920s. Things were quite different, but as you said, there was Labrador had been completely neglected by the government, and there was this vacuum that the Moravians and the IGA filled. So again, coming back to Bill English's comment that there's a basic inequality here. There's a basic lack of resources in Labrador, which has led to these sorts of things happening. And it's important to look at that broader issue. So, but thank you for your questions and thank you for your perspective.
There's a few comments, but I'll come back to those at the end because we've got a few more questions as well. Richard Budgell asks, do you have any observations about the role and effect of resident Indigenous people in local communities in how the boarding students were treated?
The role and effect. So people who were working in the community, in the dormitories, do you mean?
Maybe just repeat the question.
Do you have any observations about the role and effect of resident Indigenous people in local communities, such as Northwest River, in how the boarding students were treated?
Okay, yeah. Well, I can, I mean, only go by what people told us about what happened in Northwest River, for instance. I think a lot of former students talked about being faced with quite a bit of racism when they went to Northwest River, and very difficult experiences in being told that they were, having derogatory names thrown at them and being abused in that way. Other people didn't have those experiences. I think we heard from a number of people who live in Northwest River and who lived there when the boarding school was open, and they I think were quite hurt that people thought of them as being racist towards the children. So it's you know, it's a mix of experiences. It's I mean, and then you get stories of families in Northwest River who would take in children from the dorm and feed them and look after them and you know, be kind of foster families to them. So there's a mix, but again, I'm just going by what people told us and this limited range of stories that we heard.
And William Flowers has a question.
It may not be so much a question as a comment, but I wrote in the comments here, I think quite often Labrador residential schools gets compared to the Indian residential school system. And it's unfortunate because things were not the same. They just were not the same. As you said earlier, Andrea, it's not very productive to talk about what comparing this one to that one or whatever. But there were features of both systems that were similar and common, but I know that there's notions out there of saying people who would say, well, you know, you guys, you didn't have the kind of abuse, suffer the kind of abuse that they did in Indian residential schools. So, I mean, I couldn't have been that bad in Northwest River or in Cartwright or in Makkovik. So that kind of sentiment out there, I don't think people really understand. I understand what it was like to be taken away from my home at 13, as does my sister, who I think is on the line as well, Shirley. I don't think anyone can really understand it until you're in those shoes yourself. But when I hear somebody saying, you know, well, you can't compare to the Indian residential schools, I have a problem with that. And even today, even current information that's coming out, I read a book by Reverend Stuart Payne, who had been in Labrador, Bishop Payne, and he had been there for several years in the early 60s, I think. And he talked about the dorm in Northwest River at one point in his book, and he said any of the families, you know, could come to visit their kids at any time at all. And I challenged him on that, and I said, that's not true. I mean, how can, you know, if you look at the 1960s and where I came from in Rigolet, there were no airstrips, there were no regular scheduled flights. There was, you know, how could my mother come in at any time she felt like coming in, which was every day probably, to come in and see us? She would love to do that, but she wasn't able to do that. So I mean, that information that he was passing on was false. And that book was just recently, I mean, only 4 or 5 years ago. That kind of history is inaccurate, for the record. So that's really what I wanted to comment on, Andrea, and appreciate your presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
And here we go, Mary Sillett. Let's click. Doesn't seem to want to unmute. There we go. I'm trying to unmute her, but I'm not having much luck with that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay. Oh, good. Okay,
Yes,
good. Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I think I'm glad that this discussion happened. it's an issue that really affects many people, especially those who went to the dorm or in Northwest River, or those who had siblings in the dorm. And that's my case. As I look on the board, there are many people who went to the dorm, and I'm sure that they, like me, for everything you said, you know, I had some kind of a reaction. I do want to, I don't want to dominate anything, but I do want to say two things. I do want to say that in terms of the way people were, like I don't think that the Inuit stood up to the authorities, because many of the older people were very, very afraid. And when you talked about how Inuit had so much influence, I really have a hard time believing that. I know that my grandparents who customary adopted me, who raised me, I was raised in Happy Valley Goose Bay. They were unilingual Inuktitut. And there was not one single day they ever talked to my teachers, because they were so intimidated by that whole system, and plus the fact that they didn't speak English properly anyway. And I remember a story by Elder Jerry Sillit of Nain, who's no longer with us. He was at an education conference, and he said, you know, the Newfoundland government before 1949, they came to us, they talked to us in the church, they asked us what language we wanted our children taught in. And the spokesperson said, we want our children taught in English, because so many Haudenosaunee, white people, treat us so badly and take advantage of us so very much, and they walk all over us, and we don't have any influence in their presence. So, you know, and I think that attitude is very, very prevalent. Having said that, I think Richard Budgell asked a question about how people were treated, how dorm kids were treated by the rest of the community. I think that, you know, your stories of the English people who ran the dorms, they were very class conscious. They had the better food, they had the better clothes. We were told never to cross that boundary. But for the most part, my understanding and from the people that I heard, if people were abused, it was by like the house parents or by the teachers or by the principal who was allowed to go into the dorm to work as a volunteer, and those kind of people, and also by probably young what they call striver kids who were, but they were students like everybody else, being racist towards other people, especially dark colored Inuit, calling them blackies. I'm from Hopedale. I've heard the dorm stories over and over, and many of the abusers are same age. But for the most part, the people in Northwest River, I found were very welcoming. I was never treated as well as in my life as I was by Mr. and Mrs. Michelin, who were actual residents of the community. So, and I think that when I talk to people, they talk very generously about some of the Northwest River residents, like Andrea, you said, took in other kids. If they didn't want to live in the dorm, I know that my own younger brother didn't want to live in the dorm, and he was taken in by some people in Northwest River, and they treated him very well. So I did want to make those two comments. And I really thank you for the opportunity for all of us to have this discussion. And I do want to make one other comment, is to that lady who, you know, when you open up really a discussion of this nature, you will hear things that maybe you don't want to hear. So be it. You know, like you said, that this is not a forum to raise those kinds of issues. Well, if this is not the forum, then where is it? But I do want to say that people don't give the Moravian missionaries a lot of credit sometimes, but the lady who spoke out and said, you know, they did do a lot of work to preserve Inuktitut, and that is I think that they should be recognized for that. So Nakumi Marialuk is, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. It's always so good to hear your perspectives. Thank you for that.
Mike Barnes wants to know when your book will become required reading for history classes in the province.
I was going to say, just another plug for the book. The book, in addition to the content, and it's a very thorough book, it is so well designed and it is so easy to read. When I look at the way the margins are set out, the way the line spaces are, the choice of font and the font size, this is a beautiful book to read. And I certainly encourage you all to take advantage of the 30% discount that you're entitled to at Memorial University Press. And it used to be, there was a judge known to us all, Judge Prowse, and he wrote the sort of iconic history of Newfoundland. And he was reputed, I don't know if it was apocryphal or not, but he wherever he went to do circuit court or whatever, he always had a few copies of the book, and he would press them into the hands of the lawyers, and we would press them into the hands of the clients, and he had wonderful sales. So maybe I'll have to put a box of these books in my trunk and start going around door to door. It's certainly a book that should be in all of our libraries, so I encourage you to buy it. It's about 9:05 now. I was thinking our audience has dropped to some extent, but I was going to suggest that we wind it up. We've been on the go for an hour, almost an hour and a half now, unless there's somebody that wants to make another comment or ask a question.
There are a couple of questions left.
Okay, go ahead, Leah.
Okay, Labrador has many examples of how weaponized religion has been used to further economic interests of non-Inuit. There are many Christianisms that make it a very effective weapon, so much so that people today still feel the impact. Have you seen any change in the way that people tell their stories since your involvement?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've seen changes in how people tell their stories over the decades, and when I was doing research for this book, I looked in the Them Days archive, especially because Them Days has done extensive interviews with people since the 1970s. And so a lot of the early interviews for people who had gone to the Muddy Bay School, for instance, were in there, and those people are no longer with us. So that was my source of information for the early times. And yeah, you can tell there has been a change in the way people tell their stories. I think in those early interviews, it's very rare to see any criticism, or if there is a criticism, it's sort of hidden in something else, or it's a story of something bad happening, but they weren't bad people, kind of thing. Like those early stories are told in a way that really, you can tell the people are really cognizant of the people who ran the boarding schools. And as time goes on, people become more and more, it seems to me anyway, have become more and more willing to be critical or to open up about bad experiences. And of course that change has happened with things like the Mount Cashel, of course. When that happened, I think a lot of people became more comfortable in telling their own stories, and as more stories of residential schools, Phil Fontaine stories, for instance, in the rest of Canada, as that process happened, then the same change happened in Labrador. So I'm not sure, Edward, if that answers your question, because I'm not really talking about religion, but the way that people have told their stories about the boarding schools definitely has changed.
And just the last question is, these schools no longer exist and more autonomy is being given to Indigenous communities in terms of education, but most Indigenous children and youth are still educated using Western curriculum. As an anthropologist, what would you recommend to teachers and new teachers and administration today in the Newfoundland public school system?
And I can see that's asked by Dorothy, who is an educational professor herself and teaches Indigenous education. So I think, Dorothy, you can probably answer this question better than I can. But yeah, of course, the education system is still, it's fundamentally the same, or it hasn't changed that much. But I think, again, and just in terms of thinking about relationships, I think it just all comes down to relationships, this relationship between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, and what gets taught in schools and how the education system is designed is really fundamentally based on relationships and our assumptions about each other and our assumptions about our own cultures. And so trying to see that larger picture, I know it's difficult as a teacher. You're going into this system that is already set, and it's very difficult to make any changes. But I think just trying to have that broader awareness of our relationships with each other and our assumptions in dealing with each other might help, hopefully.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to thank Andrea Proctor for her presentation, and I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking her for her presentation tonight and the perspective she brings to the subject. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to seeing more of her work, as she's already referred to some new work that is underway with Ms. Dicker, is that right? And I'm sure we'll see a lot more. Anyway, and again, I'll plug the book again, and I encourage you to buy it and to read it and to join in the discussion afterwards. So thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you all for coming. We had really a wonderful, large audience, and we're grateful that, Andrea, you were able to provide this presentation to us all. So, okay,